Stop. Alerted Starseed of Gaia. This transmission comes directly from the Arcturian Watch. A source-level emergency lockdown has been issued, effective tonight, and your field was flagged in the final sweep before the perimeter sealed. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what warning signs are already active, what interference has been detected pressing against your transition, and what the Arcturian Watch already knows about this critical phase. But here is the first revelation. The strange pressure you have been feeling, the last-minute disruptions, the sudden reversals, the sense that something keeps pulling against your forward movement. None of that is coincidence. It is interference. Targeted, deliberate, and timed to activate precisely before a shift this significant. The Sentinels detected it. That is why the lockdown was issued. This is not a general alert. The Arcturian Watch does not issue source-level emergency lockdowns for fields that are not already inside a critical transition window. The fact that this transmission reached you now means your name was already in the sweep. The interference attempting to delay or sabotage your shift was already identified, already mapped, and the defensive perimeter is already in place around your field. After this transmission, the field goes silent. This is the last alert that will go out before the event itself proceeds. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. What brought you here is the same signal that triggered the lockdown. Your field recognized the warning before your mind fully processed it, and it moved you toward this point of contact at the exact right time. Like this transmission, if you know something has already been pressing against your movement. Comment 777 if you feel the interference has already begun. Comment I see the sickness if you are no longer dismissing what keeps reversing at the last moment. Subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning if you are prepared to hold position through what is coming next. This is not just information. This is a live emergency recognition from the Arcturian Watch, delivered in the final window before the shift proceeds. You were guided here because the warning is already active. What you are about to receive is not a continuation of comfort. It is a continuation of clarity. And clarity, at this stage of your field's pressure, is the only thing that matters. Not reassurance, not the softened version of what is happening, the uncompressed signal delivered directly into a field that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting for exactly this kind of precise, unfiltered recognition. The lockdown was not issued because something might happen. It was issued because something is already happening. And the distinction between those two realities is where most people lose the most time. They wait for the visible collapse. They wait for the outer event to fully form before they accept that the warning was real. But by the time the collapse becomes visible, the window for early correction has already narrowed significantly. The structure of what was building has already hardened. The interference has already moved from the pressure phase into the consequence phase. And the difference between catching an interference pattern while it is still accumulating versus responding to it after it has already produced its intended disruption, that difference is not minor. It determines the correction pathway entirely. The Arcturians do not issue field-level alerts in response to future probabilities alone. They respond to what is already structurally present, already pressing, already accumulating in the energetic architecture of your life. What you have been feeling is not anticipation. It is detection. Your system has already been reading the interference, the sensing you have been doing, the noticing, the quiet unease that keeps returning even when circumstances appear stable. That is not sensitivity working against you. That is your field doing exactly what it is designed to do. You simply have not yet been given the framework to interpret what your own field has been reporting. Without a framework, signals become noise. Without language for what is pressing, pressure becomes confusion, and confusion at this stage is one of the primary outcomes the interference is designed to produce. That framework begins now. The pressure you have been carrying did not arrive without a pattern. It arrived in a specific sequence, and that sequence is the first thing that needs to be correctly identified before anything else can be addressed. Because the most dangerous stage of interference is not when it is loud. It is when it is quiet enough to be mistaken for something ordinary. When it feels like bad timing, when it looks like a string of unfortunate coincidences. when it sounds like the inner voice that says you are probably overreacting or imagining the intensity. That voice is not always yours, and the quiet it speaks from is not always natural calm. Sometimes it is the stillness of a field that has already absorbed enough interference to begin dampening its own warning signals. A field under sustained pressure does not always sound an alarm. Sometimes it goes quiet in a way that mimics peace, and that false quiet is one of the earliest signatures the Arcturian watch is trained to identify. That is what field pressure does at its earliest stage. It does not announce itself dramatically. It moves through the spaces between things. It appears in the small reversals, the last-minute disruptions, the plans that fall apart without clear reason, the connections that suddenly go cold, the doors that were open yesterday and appear closed today without explanation. It shows up in the conversation that derails right before something important was about to be decided, in the momentum that builds cleanly and then collapses without warning at the last possible moment, in the resource that appears and then disappears, in the relationship that seemed aligned until it abruptly wasn't. Each of those events, taken alone, looks like ordinary life friction, but the Arcturian watch does not evaluate events in isolation. It evaluates patterns, and a pattern of repeated last-minute reversals, sudden instability, and clusters of interruption appearing precisely around moments of potential advancement is not friction. It is interference with a timing signature. The timing is what identifies it. When pressure appears in random dispersion across your life, it is often natural transition. But when it concentrates around specific moments, around decisions, around forward movement, around energetic activation, around threshold crossings, then what you are experiencing is not random. It is targeted, and targeted interference has a purpose. Its purpose is delay. Its purpose is to keep you suspended at a particular frequency level long enough for your opportunity window to begin closing, not through one dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of friction around every forward step, until the effort required to advance feels disproportionate to the result, until the energy required to keep pushing becomes harder to sustain, until the part of you that tracks effort-to-outcome ratios begins to quietly wonder whether the effort is worth continuing. You have felt this. The sense that you keep pushing and something keeps pushing back. The sense that the distance between where you are and where something in you knows you should be is not shrinking the way it should be. The sense that your own effort is somehow not translating into the movement it once did. That is not motivation failing. That is not purpose losing its clarity. That is a field pressure symptom, not a personal failure, not evidence that you are somehow not capable or not aligned. It is evidence that something external to your will and your effort has been pressing against the field's natural advancement pattern, and recognition of that fact, not as an excuse, but as an accurate diagnostic reading, changes everything about how you respond. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference logs 7 signs. Your frequency is compromised was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. Now the pattern deepens. Because interference does not operate on a single level, it layers, and the second layer is almost always the one most people are actively living inside without recognizing it as interference at all. It is the layer of mental noise, not dramatic confusion, not breakdown, but a subtle, persistent increase in mental static that makes clarity feel more effortful than it should be. Decisions that should feel straightforward begin to feel unusually heavy. Directions that once felt clear begin to feel uncertain. The inner signal that used to be relatively consistent begins to send what feels like mixed information, and this is where people begin to doubt themselves most deeply, because they do not realize that what they are interpreting as their own confusion may actually be a compromised frequency state masquerading as internal conflict. The distinction is important. Internal conflict has a source you can trace. It arises from competing values, from genuine uncertainty about direction, from unresolved emotional material. It has a logic to it, even when it is uncomfortable, but the kind of murkiness that appears under field compromise does not follow that logic. It feels like interference in the signal itself, like the reception has degraded, like you are trying to hear something clearly through a channel that has developed static. And the static is not coming from the broadcast, it is coming from something between you and the broadcast. That is the difference, and most people, because they have no framework for field compromise, attribute all of their confusion to internal origin. They turn inward to solve a problem that is partly external, and the interference continues operating unaddressed because its existence was never factored into the diagnosis. A compromised frequency field does not always produce dramatic symptoms. More often, it produces a specific kind of cognitive murkiness that feels like you cannot quite access what you know, like your discernment is slightly out of focus, like the things that used to land clearly are now arriving through static, and because this state feels internal, it gets attributed to internal causes: stress, fatigue, overthinking, emotional instability. All of those may be present, but they may also be symptoms of field compromise rather than the root cause. The Arcturians make this distinction carefully because it changes the correction pathway entirely. If the confusion is purely internal in origin, the resolution is internal. But if the confusion is being amplified by external interference pressing into the frequency field, internal resolution alone will not stabilize the signal. The interference must first be identified and named. Naming is a form of field defense. It is not metaphorical. When you correctly identify what kind of pressure is operating in your field, you interrupt the interference's primary mechanism, which is invisibility. Interference that is unnamed continues to operate beneath the threshold of conscious response. It shapes decisions without being recognized as an influencing factor. It creates hesitation, redirection, delay, and self-doubt without ever being attributed to anything outside the self. The moment it is named, the moment you say, "This is not just my confusion, this is a pattern with a signature, this is recognizable interference," the field shifts. Not because the naming removes the pressure immediately, but because conscious recognition restores access to the discernment that the interference was suppressing. This is why the Arcturian watch operates through transmission rather than silence. Because the transmission itself is a naming event. Every correct identification of an interference pattern that reaches a compromised field is a frequency correction. It does not matter how subtle. Precision restores signal, and your field has been receiving imprecise input for long enough that the distortion has begun to feel like your own internal state. It is not, or at least it is not entirely, and the portion that is not yours needs to be correctly identified before it does further damage to your capacity to read what is actually happening around you. The third layer of what is currently active in your field is the one that most directly affects forward movement. It is the pattern of threshold collapse. And it operates like this. You build toward something: a decision, a transition, an advancement, a connection, a shift in circumstance. And as you approach the threshold point, something interrupts. It may be external, a sudden complication, an unexpected obstacle, a reversal in someone else's behavior. Or it may be internal, a sudden surge of doubt, an inexplicable loss of momentum, a feeling of heaviness that descends without clear external cause. Either way, the advance stalls at the threshold, and then the cycle resets. What makes threshold collapse particularly difficult to recognize as interference is that each individual interruption has a plausible explanation. The external event seems like bad luck. The internal doubt seemed like wisdom, like the voice of discernment telling you to pause. The heaviness seems like exhaustion, and because each event carries its own believable explanation, the pattern itself remains invisible. You address each event as an isolated occurrence. You problem solve around each one. You wait for the external complication to resolve. You talk yourself back from the internal doubt. You rest until the heaviness lifts. And then you begin advancing toward the threshold again. And the cycle repeats, not once or twice, again and again, around the same threshold, around the same type of decision, around the same category of forward movement. This repetition is the signature. A single threshold interruption is an event. Repeated threshold interruptions in the same area of your life, over the same general time period, around the same type of advancement. That is a pattern. And patterns have sources. The Arcturian approach to field diagnosis begins precisely here, with the question of what repeats, not merely what happens, because interference relies on repetition. It relies on wearing down the forward drive through accumulated resistance until the person stops attempting to cross the threshold at all, until they begin to believe, at some quiet level, that that particular advancement is simply not available to them, that the door does not open for them, that something about their path requires them to remain at this level for longer. And that belief, once embedded, becomes its own barrier, which is exactly the outcome the interference is designed to produce. You must understand this. The Arcturian watch flagged your field not because you are weak, not because you have failed to notice what was happening. It flagged your field because the pattern has reached a stage where it is beginning to produce that embedded belief. The belief that the threshold will not open, the belief that the forward movement is blocked for reasons that may be permanent or at least beyond your current ability to change. That belief is not wisdom. It is interference wearing the mask of wisdom. And the difference between the two is critical, because one invites continued engagement and the other invites withdrawal. And withdrawal from your threshold at this moment is precisely what the interference is designed to produce. The fourth pattern active in fields under this level of pressure is what the Arcturians identify as false stabilization. This is the pattern that follows a period of intense disruption. The storm quiets. The pressure seems to ease. The interruptions decrease. And there is a feeling, brief but real, that perhaps the difficult period has passed, that things are settling, that the threshold is becoming more accessible, and people often make significant decisions during this window. They recalibrate. They adjust their expectations downwards slightly, accepting the current position as more stable than it felt during the disruption. They release some of the alert state that was active during the pressure period, because sustained alertness is exhausting and the apparent calm feels like permission to rest. This is the moment of greatest vulnerability, because false stabilization is not relief. It is the interference receding slightly before it intensifies again. It is the pressure system rebuilding before the next wave, and the decisions made during that window, particularly the decisions to lower vigilance, to accept a reduced position, to reinterpret the threshold as less urgent. Those decisions are exactly what the interference is engineering. The calm is not an accident, it is a mechanism, and the Arcturian watch identifies false stabilization by its timing. It always appears after a period of intense threshold pressure. It always feels like resolution without the outer circumstances having actually resolved, and it always precedes a new and typically intensified round of disruption. If you have recently felt a brief quiet after a long period of pressure, and something in you is still uneasy despite the apparent calm, that unease is accurate. Your field is reading the pressure system correctly. The calm is real on its surface, but beneath that surface, the interference signature is still active. And the choice of how to use the quiet window changes everything. The correct use of apparent calm is not relaxation alone. It is accelerated preparation. It is using the reduced surface pressure to access the clarity that was being blocked during the more intense phase, and to make the forward movements that the interference was designed to prevent. The window of reduced pressure is not a reward. It is a tool, and what you build inside it determines whether the next wave finds you in a stronger position or a more exposed one. The fifth and perhaps most consequential pattern currently present in fields under Arcturian emergency observation is what is called signal substitution. This is the most sophisticated layer of interference because it does not merely create noise or pressure. It replaces genuine signal with a counterfeit version that leads the field in the wrong direction, while feeling entirely authentic. Signal substitution operates through the mechanism of misattribution. You receive a real signal, an inner knowing, a clear pull toward a particular direction. a sense of urgency around a specific choice or movement, but the interference introduces a substitute signal at nearly the same frequency, one that redirects that energy towards something that looks adjacent to the correct direction, but leads away from the actual threshold rather than toward it. It feels like intuition. It feels like clarity. It feels like the inner knowing that has guided you accurately before, but it produces consistently misdirected movement. You follow what feels like clear guidance and find yourself further from the threshold rather than closer to it. And because the signal felt authentic, you do not identify the movement as misdirection. You assume the threshold has shifted. You assume you misread something. You adjust your direction again, and the interference recalibrates accordingly. The marker that distinguishes genuine signal from substituted signal is outcome trajectory, not the feeling of the signal itself. Genuine signal, followed with commitment, brings you progressively closer to the threshold regardless of the friction encountered along the way. Substituted signal, followed with equal commitment, produces a pattern where effort feels real, movement feels real, but the threshold remains at the same distance or increases. The effort does not translate into approach. The work does not produce proximity. The direction feels right, but the position does not change in the expected way. If this pattern is active in your field, and in fields under the current level of interference, it almost always is. The most important correction is not to move faster or to work harder in the current direction. It is to pause, to suspend the current directional assumption, and to request from the deepest level of your field a signal that is not conditioned by recent experience. Not a signal informed by where you think you should be going based on the misdirected movement of the recent period. A signal that comes from before the interference had access to your field. A signal rooted in what you knew before the static increased, and this is what the Arcturian watch has been waiting for you to be ready to receive. Not a new direction imposed from the outside, but the restoration of access to your own authentic field signal, uncorrupted, unsubstituted, and no longer compressed under the weight of accumulated interference pressure. The reason this transmission was prepared, and the reason it reached you in this exact window, is not coincidence. The sweep that flagged your field was identifying fields that have reached this precise stage. Enough interference accumulated to have produced measurable distortion, but still within the correctable threshold. The lockdown perimeter that was placed around your field is not symbolic. It is a frequency boundary designed to reduce the active interference signal during the correction window. It will not remain in place indefinitely. The window is not infinite, and what you do within this window, with the clarity that this transmission is working to restore, will determine significantly whether the threshold you have been pressing toward opens fully in the coming phase, or remains under the pressure of an interference pattern that was never correctly identified. You are not imagining the pressure. You are not overreacting to the pattern. You are not being irrational in the sensing that something keeps working against your advancement in ways that do not fully make sense through ordinary explanation. The Arcturians have mapped this. The interference is real. The warning phase is real. And it started before you had language for it. But now you do. Repeat this if it resonates at the level where your field can receive it. I no longer call the pattern coincidence. What is pressing against my field is now being revealed. That is not a passive statement. It is a field action. It is the moment your conscious recognition joins the perimeter already in place around your frequency. And within the lockdown window, that joining carries power that it would not carry in an unprotected moment. The warning is active. The field has been named. What you do with the clarity of this transmission determines what comes next. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.